the night and the blooming blessings. The forest was alive with whispers, though no lips moved to speak them. The night, cloaked in steel dulled by years of travel, trudged down a path that had not existed moments before. Shadows shifted around him, not menacing but curious, as if the trees themselves craned to glimpse the solitary traveller. His blade hung heavy at his side, its once pristine edge scarred by countless battles. Yet here, in this ancient place, the weight of it felt unfamiliar, almost unwelcome. He paused at the edge of a clearing that seemed to materialize as if summoned by his presence. Moonlight spilled through the canopy above, though the moon itself was nowhere to be seen. Instead, the light glowed faintly silver, casting the glade in a dreamlike haze. The air shimmered with a strange vitality, and he realized he was not alone. Elves, dozens of them. Their forms were ethereal, their movements fluid and otherworldly. They danced in weaving circles, their feet brushing the earth yet leaving no trace. Their laughter carried like wind through hollow reeds, soft and melodic, but layered with an ancient resonance that sent shivers down his spine. He stepped closer, his boots crunching softly against the undergrowth. The sound broke through the harmony of the glade, and all at once the elves turned to face him. Their eyes, luminous and knowing, regarded him not with fear, but with a quiet curiosity. One of them, a woman whose hair shone like spun silver, stepped forward, her feet barely bending the grass beneath her. "You wander far from your realm, knight," she said, her voice smooth as water over stone. "And yet, you come not by chance." He straightened, his hand instinctively brushing the hilt of his sword. "I did not mean to intrude. I found no sign to mark this land." "No sign is needed," she replied, tilting her head slightly, her gaze piercing. "You were meant to find us." He hesitated. The words should have unnerved him, yet there was a familiarity in her tone, a resonance he could not place. Before he could respond, she reached out, her slender fingers unfurling to reveal a single flower. It was unlike any he had seen. A bloom of midnight blue, its petals veined with veins of faint gold that pulsed like a heartbeat. "For you," she said. "Take it." "What is this?" he asked, his voice wary yet soft. "A gift? Or perhaps a key?" she said enigmatically. "Each flower in this glade holds a blessing, a truth waiting to be claimed. The question is, are you ready to embrace it?" He stared at the flower, its glow casting delicate patterns on his gauntlet. 100 questions surged in his mind, but none made it past his lips. Against his better judgment, he extended his hand. The moment his fingers brushed the petals, a warmth spread through his palm, as though the flower itself exhaled life into him. The elves resumed their revelry, their movements weaving an intricate dance around him. The knight stepped back, clutching the flower tightly, feeling its pulse synchronize with his own. Though he remained still, The glade seemed to shift and breathe around him, the air alive with a power he could not name. As the music rose, the knight realized the clearing was not merely a place, it was a threshold. He had crossed into a realm that existed parallel to his own, a world untouched by the weight of mortal strife. Yet as the elf maiden's eyes lingered on him, he sensed that this world held secrets tied to him, secrets as ancient and enigmatic as the festival itself. Unseen by the revelers, the knight turned the flower in his hand, its glow reflecting faintly in his weathered eyes. He had no name for the feeling that stirred within him, but it clung to him like the forest's whispers, soft yet insistent. And so the knight remained, a silent observer in a world that seemed to hum with answers to questions he had yet to ask. The music of the festival grew richer as the knight lingered in the glade, each note weaving into the fabric of the forest itself. The elves danced in patterns so intricate they seemed not random but purposeful, as though their movements were part of an unseen ritual. The knight remained at the periphery, his fingers still wrapped around the luminous flower given to him by the silver-haired elf. Its gentle warmth pulsed in time with his heartbeat, an intimate rhythm that unsettled and intrigued him. Around him, flowers bloomed with impossible vibrancy. Each one glowed faintly, its petals shimmering as though they were woven from starlight. No two were alike. Some burned with fiery hues, while others radiated soft blues or greens, like fragments of a forgotten dawn. And yet, for all their beauty, there was a weight to them, a presence that pressed upon the knight's senses, like a voice he could not hear but felt deep within his chest. He approached the edge of the glade, where a cluster of golden flowers bent toward him, their stems swaying as though drawn by his presence. Their light flickered briefly, and for a moment he thought he saw faint runes etched into their petals. He leaned closer, but the symbols faded before his eyes. "They whisper to you, don't they?" The voice came from behind him, soft and lilting. The knight turned to find the silver-haired elf once more. She stood with a grace that seemed effortless, her arms cradling a bouquet of pale white blooms. Her eyes, like polished obsidian, reflected the glade's otherworldly light. "What are they?" he asked, his voice low, almost reverent. "Gifts," she said, stepping closer. "Each flower carries a blessing, a fragment of magic bestowed by the forest itself. Yet blessings are not simple things. They can reveal, transform, or even bind." Her words hung in the air like mist, and the knight felt their weight settle over him. "You said I must choose wisely. How do I know which blessing is mine?" A faint smile touched her lips, enigmatic and unreadable. "The flowers will guide you, but beware. What you seek and what they reveal may not be the same." The knight's gaze drifted back to the golden blooms, but he did not approach. Instead, he turned his attention to the glade as a whole, watching as the elves moved among the flowers, their hands brushing petals with an intimacy that seemed almost sacred. Each time their fingertips grazed a bloom, the air shimmered with an unseen energy, and the flowers brightened momentarily, as if sharing a secret. One elf, a young male with hair like spun copper, plucked a single crimson flower. As he held it aloft, its petals unfurled in a spiral, revealing a tiny spark of light at its core. The spark rose into the air, spinning lazily before dissolving into a shower of golden dust. The elf closed his eyes, his expression one of quiet joy, as though he had been granted a vision known only to him. The knight watched, transfixed. The glade felt alive, not merely with movement, but with intention. Every flower, every gesture seemed part of a larger tapestry, a story unfolding before his eyes, but written in a language he could not understand. "What truth do these flowers hold?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The silver-haired elf regarded him for a long moment. "They hold what you need most," she said. "For some, it is clarity. For others, healing. But for you..." Her voice trailed off, and her gaze grew distant, as if she were peering into something far beyond the glade. "For you, I believe they hold a memory." The knight frowned. "A memory?" She nodded. "The forest does not call strangers to our festival. You are here because you belong, though you may not yet understand why." Her words stirred something deep within him, a faint echo of a feeling he had long buried. The flower in his hand pulsed more insistently, its warmth spreading through his arm and into his chest. He looked down at it, his grip tightening. "Follow the flowers," she said, stepping away. "They will show you the path." As she vanished into the crowd of elves, the knight felt the weight of her words settle over him. He glanced around the glade once more, the flowers glowing brighter in his peripheral vision. The air hummed with potential, and though he did not yet know what awaited him, he understood one thing with certainty. This festival was not merely a celebration. It was a revelation waiting to unfold. The knight moved deeper into the glade, the festival's symphony of light and sound fading to a hushed rhythm as though the forest itself held its breath. The flower in his hand pulsed steadily, its warmth no longer gentle but insistent, as if guiding him toward an unseen destination. Around him, the glowing blooms seemed to shift in color and intensity, their patterns changing with his every step. He knelt by a cluster of silver flowers whose petals shimmered like moonlight on water. He reached out, hesitating as he noticed faint symbols etched into their delicate surfaces. The markings were unlike any script he had encountered, fluid and organic, as if the flowers themselves had grown them. When his fingers brushed a petal, his vision blurred, and for a fleeting moment he saw a memory not his own. A child, no, an elven child, ran through a similar glade, their laughter echoing like a song carried by the wind. The forest embraced them, its trees bending protectively, its flowers blooming in their wake. The image dissolved as quickly as it had come, leaving the knight breathless and disoriented. "They remember," a voice said softly behind him. He turned to see the silver-haired elf once more, her presence so silent it felt as though she had materialized from the air itself. She knelt beside him, her gaze fixed on the silver blooms. "The flowers carry the memories of the forest," she said, "of those who have walked these paths, danced beneath these trees. Some memories are ours, others are far older than even we." The knight straightened, his grip tightening on the midnight blue flower in his hand. "Why would they show this to me?" "Perhaps they know you better than you know yourself," she said, her voice as enigmatic as ever. The knight looked down at the flower he held, its golden veins glowing brighter now, as if responding to his unease. He wanted to ask her what she meant, but she had already stood and begun walking, her movements as fluid as the forest's whispers. "Come," she said without turning, "there is more to see." He followed her deeper into the glade, where the light grew softer, the colors more subdued. Here, the flowers were fewer but larger, their petals unfurled like open hands. The air hummed with an almost imperceptible vibration, and the knight felt the weight of the forest pressing in around him. It was not oppressive but profound, as though he stood in the presence of something vast and ancient. The elf stopped before a single flower, its petals a deep, iridescent black. It seemed to absorb the light around it, its edges outlined in a faint, shifting glow. "This," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "is the heart of the bloom." The knight stared at it, unease prickling at the edges of his mind. "What makes it different?" "It is not a blessing as the others are," she said. "It is a mirror. It reflects not what you wish to see, but what is hidden. Many fear its truth." The knight hesitated, his instincts warring with his curiosity. He stepped closer, the warmth of the flower in his hand intensifying. The petals of the black bloom began to tremble, their faint glow growing stronger, as though sensing his presence. He reached out slowly, his fingers brushing its surface. The moment he made contact, the world around him vanished. He stood now in a place that was both familiar and alien. The forest was there, but it was different, darker, quieter, as if suspended in time. He saw himself as a child, running through the trees. He was not alone. Elves surrounded him, their faces lit with joy, their hands reaching out to guide him. But then the scene shifted. Shadows fell over the glade, and the laughter turned to cries. The child was torn away, his small hands grasping for the elves as they faded into the dark. The vision shattered, and the knight stumbled back, his breath ragged. The black flower's glow dimmed, returning to its faint, enigmatic shimmer. The silver-haired elf stood beside him, her expression solemn. "You were one of us," she said, her voice heavy with certainty. "A child of two worlds, taken from ours when the darkness came." The knight could not speak. His heart pounded, his thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and revelation. The warmth of the flower in his hand spread through him, no longer a comfort, but a blazing certainty. The forest had not simply called him, it had claimed him. The knight stood frozen, his breath catching in his throat as the weight of the revelation settled over him. The glade seemed to hold its breath with him, the rustling of leaves and distant hum of the elven music fading into an almost oppressive silence. He turned to the silver-haired elf, his voice rough as he finally managed to speak. "How can this be? I have no memory of such a life." The elf met his gaze, her eyes filled with a sadness that seemed to stretch across centuries. "Memory is a fragile thing," she said, "especially when it is taken, not lost." "Taken?" The knight's words were sharp, disbelief and anger mingling. "Who would do such a thing?" "The same darkness that stole you from our world," she replied. "A force that sought to sever the bond between you and this place. It feared the power you carry, the connection you hold to both realms." He wanted to refute her words, to cast them aside as fantasy. Yet deep within him, something stirred, a sense of familiarity he could not ignore. The visions from the black flower had not felt like dreams. They had been too vivid, too raw. He could still feel the pull of small hands reaching out, the shadowy figures that had torn him away. The elf stepped closer, her voice soft but firm. "You are not here by chance. The forest called you back, even after all this time. It remembered what you had forgotten." The knight glanced at the flower in his hand. Its pulse had steadied, the warmth now a steady thrum in his palm, as if reassuring him. He closed his eyes, the weight of the truth pressing against his mind. For years he had wandered, searching for a purpose he could not define. Every path had felt hollow, every battle meaningless. He had thought it was simply the burden of a weary soul. Now he saw it for what it was, a yearning for a home he had not known he'd lost. "What am I supposed to do with this?" he asked, his voice breaking. "I cannot go back to being the child I once was." The elf's expression softened, a faint smile playing on her lips. "No, you cannot. But you are more than that child. You are a bridge, a living link between the mortal world and ours. That is why you were taken, and that is why you have been returned. Your path lies not in reclaiming what was lost, but in forging something new." He looked at her, searching for answers in her inscrutable gaze. "What does that mean? How am I to bridge these worlds?" "Start by remembering," she said. "Not just with your mind, but with your heart. Let the forest speak to you as it once did. Trust the bond that has always been there, even when you could not see it." The The knight turned away, his eyes scanning the glade. The flowers glowed softly in the dim light, their presence a reminder of the magic that suffused this place. He took a deep breath, allowing the forest's energy to wash over him. For the first time, he felt not as an outsider, but as something more, something connected. He closed his eyes again, this time not to escape, but to listen. Whispers filled his mind, soft and fleeting, like the brush of wind through leaves. Images surfaced, a boy running through these woods, his laughter blending with the music of the elves, a hand reaching out, not to take but to offer. These were not just memories, they were fragments of a story, one that had shaped him even as he had forgotten it. When he opened his eyes, the silver-haired elf stood watching him, her expression unreadable. "You are beginning to see," she said. He nodded slowly, the weight of his doubts easing. "I do not know what lies ahead," he admitted. "But I know I cannot turn away from this." The elf inclined her head, a gesture of acknowledgement. "Then take the blessing of this night. It will guide you even when the path seems unclear." The knight looked down at the flower in his hand. Its glow had grown brighter, its golden veins shimmering with a light that felt both ancient and alive. He held it close, its warmth spreading through him like a promise. The festival around him began to stir once more, the elves resuming their dance, their laughter and music weaving through the glade like a living thing. The knight stood among them, no longer an outsider, but a part of something greater. Though he did not yet fully understand his place in this world, he felt its call in his very bones. And for the first time in his wandering life, he felt he was exactly where he was meant to be. The night deepened, and the glade seemed to glow with a life all its own. The elves moved in elegant spirals, their dances weaving through the trees as though each step traced unseen patterns in the air. The knight stood still, the flower's light in his hand reflecting faintly on his worn armor. It pulsed in rhythm with his heart, its warmth no longer foreign but comforting, like the embrace of an old friend long forgotten. The silver-haired elf returned to his side, her gaze fixed on the flower he held. "The blessing is yours now," she said, her voice softer than before. "The forest's gift to you, but it carries a burden as well." "What burden?" the knight asked, though he suspected he already knew. "The burden of choice," she replied, her eyes dark and deep. "You are of two worlds, but you cannot live fully in both. This is the nature of the bridge. You connect what is separate, but you remain apart." The weight of her words settled over him. He looked at the elves, their joy undiminished as they celebrated the festival. He looked at the flowers, each one a luminous vessel of mystery and magic. And he looked at the forest, vast and timeless, its whispers growing louder in his mind. It was a home he had always sought, yet now that it was within his grasp, He understood that it could never truly be his alone. The elf seemed to sense his thoughts. "You need not decide now," she said. "The blessing will remain with you, whether you stay or leave. It is a part of you now, as the forest has always been." The knight nodded, though his heart felt heavy. He turned to the flower in his hand, its light brighter than ever, the golden veins shifting and pulsing like streams of molten sunlight. He brought it closer, letting its warmth seep into him fully. As he did, he felt a surge of energy, memories and sensations flooding him in a rush. He saw the boy he had once been, laughing and running through the glade. He saw the shadowed figures that had torn him away, their faces obscured by darkness. He saw his life as a wandering knight. The battles, the loneliness, the endless search for something he could never name. And he saw the elves, their laughter and music, their ancient wisdom and quiet sorrow, all of it wove together into a single thread, binding him to the glade and the world beyond. When the vision faded, he felt a clarity he had not known before. The silver-haired elf watched him closely. "You have seen the truth," she said. "Now you must decide how to carry it." The knight took a deep breath, his grip tightening on the flower. "I cannot stay," he said finally, his voice steady despite the ache in his chest. "The world beyond needs me still, but I will not forget what I have seen here. I will not forget where I come from." The elf smiled faintly, her expression one of quiet understanding. "Then take this with you," she said, gesturing to the flower. "It will guide you, even when you walk far from these woods. And know this, the forest will always remember you, as you now remember it." The knight bowed his head, the weight of his decision settling over him like a cloak. He turned toward the edge of the glade, where the trees stood like sentinels, their branches entwined to form an archway that shimmered faintly in the moonlight. As he stepped forward, the elves parted to let him pass, their eyes filled with a quiet reverence. The silver-haired elf called out to him one last time. "Go with the forest's blessing, knight. Though you walk between worlds, you are never alone." The knight paused at the archway, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. He turned back briefly, his gaze sweeping over the glade, the elves, and the glowing flowers. Then, with a final nod, he stepped through the archway and into the night. The forest seemed to breathe around him as he walked away, its whispers fading to a soft hum. The flower in his hand glowed steadily, a beacon of light in the darkness. Though the road ahead was uncertain, he felt a quiet strength within him, a bond that would never break, no matter how far he traveled. And as the glade disappeared behind him, the knight knew that he carried more than a blessing. He carried a piece of the forest itself, a connection to a world that had shaped him and would guide him always.